In the spring of 1988, 11 people packed their gear in small apartments and suburban garages across Arizona and Nevada, all preparing for the same trip. They weren't strangers pulled together by a flyer or an ad. Most of them had known each other for years. Some had climbed together. Others had guided the same routes dozens of times. They trusted each other in the way people only do after long days in heat, cold, exhaustion, and risk. At the center of the group was Caleb Monroe, 36 years old, a licensed outdoor guide, former search and rescue volunteer. He was the kind of man people deferred to without realizing they were doing it. Calm voice, measured decisions, the type who double-checked maps, not because he was anxious, but because he believed mistakes were usually preventable. The plan was simple. A spring expedition into southern Utah's Red Canyon region, a multi-day hike through an area known for narrow sandstone corridors, high ridges, and long stretches without cell reception, the kind of place that demanded experience, not luck. According to the maps Caleb had, older topographic prints he'd used before, the route was public land. Challenging, but legal. Remote, but documented. What those maps didn't show were the changes that had quietly taken place in the early 1980s. Federal land adjustments, restricted parcels, temporary closures that were renewed again and again without much public explanation. In some cases, the only markers were faded warning signs nailed to posts miles from any trailhead. In others, there was nothing at all. Locals in nearby towns noticed the changes more than visitors did. Ranchers talked about livestock that wandered into certain canyons and never came back. Hunters mentioned seeing unfamiliar trucks parked far from any road, gone by morning. A few people claimed they'd spotted armed patrols at night, moving without headlights, without insignia. Most of it sounded like exaggeration. Stories people tell when a place starts feeling unfamiliar. In the days before the hike, the group stopped for supplies in a small Utah town. Over coffee and fuel, a store clerk asked where they were headed. When Caleb mentioned Red Canyon, the man paused longer than expected. Said some trails out there didn't exist anymore. Said the land wasn't what it used to be. He didn't explain further. Just shrugged, rang them up, and wished them luck. They laughed about it later. Nervous locals. Old rumors. The kind of warnings people gave when they didn't want outsiders around. None of it registered as serious. They'd heard worse before. And nothing on any official map suggested danger beyond the environment itself. On the morning they entered the canyon, the weather was clear. Cool air, high visibility, the kind of conditions guides hope for. They parked at a legitimate trailhead, signed the registry, and set off on foot. Spirits were high. The pace was steady. Conversation drifted easily between gear, old trips, and plans for the summer. For the first several miles, everything matched expectations. The trail followed a dry wash, then climbed toward higher ground. Around midday, Caleb consulted the map and made a decision that would later define the entire case. An old fire road appeared, overgrown but passable. According to the map, it offered a shorter route toward their intended campsite. It wasn't marked as closed. There were no signs, no fences, no gates, just a faint track cutting through the terrain. They took it. No one realized that the fire road had been decommissioned years earlier, that beyond a certain point, the land designation changed, that they were crossing from public backcountry into a restricted zone that existed more on paper than on the ground. As the afternoon wore on, subtle changes began to appear. The road narrowed, tire marks vanished. Old metal posts stood without signs attached. One hiker remarked on how quiet it felt. Not peaceful, just empty. No birds, no wind moving through brush. It didn't alarm them. Remote places often felt that way. Near dusk, Caleb decided to check in. Standard procedure. He keyed the radio and contacted a ranger outpost listed on his permit paperwork. The transmission was brief. Clear. Professional. He confirmed their position, estimated progress, and stated their plan to make camp before dark. The ranger logged the call, noted nothing unusual. Caleb's voice was relaxed. No stress, no hesitation, no indication of concern. That transmission would become the last confirmed contact any of them would ever make. As daylight faded, the canyon swallowed sound. The group moved deeper into terrain that no longer appeared on current maps. They didn't know it. They couldn't have. There was no warning, no moment that felt like crossing a boundary. Just a gradual sense of isolation, the kind seasoned hikers expect and accept. Somewhere after sunset, something changed. It wasn't recorded. It wasn't heard over radio. There was no distress call, no signal flare. Whatever happened didn't begin with panic. Later, analysis would suggest they made camp, that they ate, that they settled in for the night believing everything was normal. When morning came, no one at the ranger station noticed anything wrong. They weren't overdue yet. Search protocols weren't triggered. In remote areas, silence was expected. But the canyon remained silent longer than it should have. By the second day, weather moved in. Wind picked up. Visibility dropped. Still, no one called it in. The group had experience. They could handle delays. By the third day, concern began to surface. Family members back home checked answering machines. No messages, no updates. Caleb was reliable. He always checked in. At the ranger outpost, someone finally looked back at the logbook. The last transmission. Calm, ordinary. Nothing that hinted at danger. Just 11 people moving, through a place they believed they understood. Search and rescue wouldn't be notified until the following morning. By then, the canyon had already done what it does best. It erased evidence. It absorbed sound. It made certainty impossible. Investigators would later say the most unsettling part wasn't the disappearance itself. People go missing in the wilderness. Accidents happen. Weather turns. Animals attack. Injuries compound. What unsettled them was the absence of chaos. No broken gear found early. No emergency signals. No signs of a struggle. Just a clean line in a logbook. A normal radio call. And then nothing. As if the group had stepped into a space where normal rules no longer applied. As if crossing that unmarked line had triggered something none of them could see, and no one had warned them about. By the time the first search teams prepared to enter Red Canyon, the hikers were already gone. And whatever had taken them was no longer interested in being found. By the third, morning after the hikers were supposed to return, concern stopped being casual and became specific. It wasn't panic yet. It was the quiet kind of worry that settles in when people who always follow their routines suddenly don't. Caleb Monroe had a habit of checking in. Even on trips where radio contact was optional, he found a way. Families knew that. Friends knew that. When no messages came through, no answering machines clicked on, and no one showed up at the prearranged pickup point, the silence began to feel deliberate. Calls went out from Arizona and Nevada to ranger stations in Utah. Names were given. Dates. A route. The first responses were polite but non-committal. Red Canyon was remote. Delays happened. Weather slowed progress. People ran late all the time. Someone suggested waiting another day. By the fourth day, waiting no longer felt reasonable. A missing persons report was finally initiated. But even then, the response moved slowly. Jurisdiction immediately became a problem. Parts of Red Canyon fell under state land management. Other sections were overseen by federal agencies. No one seemed eager to take full responsibility. Requests for aircraft had to be approved. Requests for search dogs had to be cleared. Forms were filed. Calls were returned hours later. From the outside, it looked like an operation ramping up. From the inside, it felt like friction. Every decision took longer than it should have. Every request met a boundary no one could clearly explain. When a helicopter was finally authorized, its flight path was restricted. Certain areas were labeled off-limits. No reason was given, just instructions. Pilots followed them. Search teams moved on foot along the hikers' intended route. They found what they expected to find at first: boot prints, trail markers, signs of normal passage. Then, abruptly, those signs ended. Prints that should have continued simply stopped, as if the group had vanished mid-stride. There were no signs of scrambling, no slide marks, no evidence of a fall or sudden change in direction. Experienced searchers noticed it immediately. People don't disappear cleanly in the wilderness. They leave traces. Even careful hikers leave something behind. On the 6th day, the first real piece of evidence surfaced. A volunteer spotted fabric caught on low brush nearly 2 miles off the mapped route. It was a backpack. Torn, but not shredded. The damage wasn't consistent with animals. No claw marks, no bite patterns, just a single rip, as if someone had yanked it hard. The pack belonged to Lena Hartwell. Inside were items that made no sense to leave behind. Her wallet, a folded map, snacks still sealed, a small notebook. Nothing was missing. Nothing was blood-stained. There was no sign of a struggle in the surrounding area, no footprints leading away. No drag marks, just the backpack, placed in a way that felt almost intentional. When word reached the families, the tone of the operation changed. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't weather. Something had gone wrong. Search efforts expanded, but with limits that grew harder to justify. Dog handlers were told certain zones were unavailable due to terrain concerns. Ground teams were redirected away from areas that seemed, to them, the most logical places to search. Questions were asked. Answers were vague. As more ground was covered, more inconsistencies appeared. Campfire rings were found, cold, undisturbed, perfectly intact, as if the fires had been put out carefully. Cooking gear sat neatly arranged. Tents were gone, but not torn or abandoned. They were simply missing. 2 handheld radios were recovered days apart. Both had been smashed, not dropped, not crushed under rocks. The casings were broken deliberately, antennas snapped cleanly, batteries removed. The damage was precise, controlled, and impossible to explain as an accident. One searcher noted that if a hiker fell or panicked, a radio might break. It wouldn't be dismantled. The most disturbing find came from a narrow ravine late in the 2nd week. A small journal, damp but legible. It belonged to Evan Pike, one of the younger members of the group. His entries were methodical. Weather notes, distances, minor observations. Then, halfway down a page, the writing stopped mid-line. The last words referenced men on the ridge. There was no elaboration, no description, no fear expressed outright. Just the mention, as if it were something Evan expected to return to later. Something that, in his mind, hadn't yet become dangerous. Investigators read and reread that line. Men on the ridge. Not figures. Not shadows. Men. From that point forward, the search was no longer framed as rescue, at least not privately. Conversations shifted. Rangers spoke more carefully. Law enforcement began attending briefings. The possibility of human involvement moved from unthinkable to unavoidable. Still, there were no suspects, no witnesses, no reports of gunshots, no signs of struggle on a scale that matched 11 people. It was as if the group had been intercepted, contained, and erased without chaos. Families were told little. Updates came slowly and said less than they should have. Some parents drove to Utah themselves, desperate to see the area, only to be turned away from certain access points. They were told it was unsafe, that conditions were unstable, that it wasn't personal. But it felt personal. Days turned into weeks. The terrain yielded fragments, not answers. A boot here, a torn strap there. Enough to confirm presence, not enough to explain absence. Searchers began to talk among themselves about how quiet the canyon felt, about how directions didn't always line up with maps, about how certain questions were better left unasked if they wanted to keep working. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, momentum slowed. Resources were pulled. Attention shifted elsewhere. The wilderness had not given up its dead, and without bodies, conclusions stayed just out of reach. What remained was a growing sense of dread, not fear of the unknown wilderness, but fear of something deliberate, organized, controlled. 11 experienced hikers didn't simply vanish. Not without noise, not without mistakes, not without leaving behind more than a few scattered belongings. Whatever had happened in Red Canyon hadn't unfolded in panic. It had unfolded with order. And as the search stretched on, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whoever the hikers had encountered out there had seen them first, had time to act, and had made sure there would be no witnesses left to explain what happened next. By the time search teams began finding remains months later, investigators would already know, deep down, that this wasn't a case of people lost to the land. It was a case of people taken from it. Nearly a month after the search began, Red Canyon finally gave something back. It wasn't a ranger. It wasn't a helicopter. Crew. It was 2 recreational hikers, unrelated to the case, moving through a narrow box canyon that didn't appear on most modern maps. They weren't looking for anything. They were following a slot route recommended by a friend, unaware they were stepping into the outer edge of an active investigation that had already begun to lose momentum. What they found stopped them cold. At first, they thought it was animal remains. Sun-bleached bone was common in the desert. But then they saw the shape of a boot, then fabric, then the unmistakable outline of a human ribcage, partially exposed beneath layers of sand and debris. They backed away and reported it immediately. Within hours, law enforcement sealed the area. What followed over the next several days would permanently change the nature of the case. Search and rescue gave way to forensic teams. Missing persons posters were replaced with evidence logs. The question was no longer where the hikers were, it was how they died. The first body was located at the base of a rock shelf, positioned in a way that didn't suggest a fall. There were no fractures consistent with impact, no scatter pattern. The remains appeared placed, not deposited by chance. As teams expanded outward, more remains were discovered. Not together. Not in a single grave. They were scattered in small clusters throughout the box canyon and its surrounding corridors. 2 here, 3 there, some alone. All within a contained area that was difficult to access without knowing exactly where you were going. By the end of the week, all 11 hikers had been accounted for. The condition of the remains told a story that was impossible to misinterpret. Each victim had suffered gunshot wounds to the head or upper torso. The shots were close range, precise, lethal. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive injuries, no broken bones from restraint, no chaotic pattern of fire. Several skulls showed downward trajectories. Kneeling height, execution height. Ballistics experts worked quietly. The ammunition recovered from the scene was military grade, not illegal to possess, but uncommon. The casings carried no serial trace, no manufacturing defects that could link them to a specific batch. Whoever had used them knew how to avoid leaving a trail. Autopsies revealed something even more disturbing. Based on stomach contents, dehydration levels, and insect activity, investigators determined the hikers had not been killed immediately. They had been held alive for at least 24 to 36 hours after their disappearance. They had been fed. Food wrappers found near the bodies matched items from their own packs. Some wrists showed signs of binding. Not rope burns deep enough to break skin, but enough to leave impressions on bone. Fibers recovered from several skulls were consistent with blindfold material. This wasn't a confrontation gone wrong. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was detention. The realization hit investigators hard. 11 people had been intercepted, restrained, and controlled in terrain so remote that no one heard them. No one stumbled across them. No one interrupted the process. The canyon had been quiet because it was meant to be. As details leaked to families, grief shifted into something sharper. Confusion. Anger. The kind of pain that demands explanation. Parents asked who could do this, why their children hadn't been able to call for help, why no one had warned them the land was dangerous. Authorities offered little. Press releases were carefully worded. The incident was described as isolated. There was no immediate threat to the public. No suspects were named. No motive suggested. Large portions of the forensic report were sealed. Entire sections were redacted before families ever saw them. When asked why, officials cited ongoing investigative considerations. The problem was that the investigation didn't feel ongoing. Search zones were quietly scaled back. Media access was restricted. Certain locations within the canyon were declared off-limits due to environmental instability. Families were discouraged from visiting the recovery sites. Memorial requests were deferred indefinitely. Behind closed doors, investigators struggled with the same questions the public wasn't allowed to ask. Who had the authority to operate armed in a restricted zone without identification? Who had the training to control 11 adults without resistance? Who had the confidence to execute them and disappear without leaving a trace? Local suspects were non-existent. There were no known criminal groups operating in the area, no history of similar violence, no reports of missing weapons, no intercepted communications. The idea of a random killer didn't hold up. Neither did the idea of a spontaneous crime. Everything about the scene pointed to planning, familiarity with the terrain, knowledge of response times, confidence that no one would interfere. Families began to sense that something was being withheld. Meetings ended with vague reassurances. Phone calls went unanswered. Requests for full autopsy details were delayed or denied. One father asked a question that no one could answer honestly. How could 11 people be killed execution style on public land without anyone noticing? No one had a response. In the weeks that followed, the case drifted into an uncomfortable limbo. Officially, it was solved in the sense that the missing were found. Unofficially, it was a dead end. No arrests, no suspects, no theories shared beyond speculation. The canyon, meanwhile, remained partially closed. Access points were monitored. Trail maps were quietly updated. Old fire roads were erased from public records. To the families, it felt like the land itself was being rewritten. What haunted investigators most wasn't the brutality. It was the restraint. Whoever carried out the killings didn't act out of fear or rage. They acted with discipline, with procedure, as if following an order rather than committing a crime. That implication lingered in every unanswered question. Because if this wasn't the act of criminals, then it meant something far more disturbing. It meant the hikers hadn't died because they were unlucky. They had died because they crossed into a place where they weren't supposed to exist. As the case faded from headlines, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The canyon had not revealed everything it knew. It had only released what it could no longer hide. And somewhere beyond the sealed files and restricted zones, the people responsible were still out there, carrying the certainty that they had gotten away with it. By the end of 1989, the Red Canyon case had slipped into a kind of institutional silence. It was still technically open, still assigned a number, still mentioned in briefings when someone remembered to bring it up, but nothing moved. Files stayed where they were. Evidence sat boxed and cataloged. No new task forces were formed. No fresh resources were allocated. It was as if the case had been gently placed on a shelf and left there, not officially abandoned, just quietly ignored. For the families, time stretched painfully. Grief didn't resolve itself. It hardened. Each unanswered question became heavier than the last. They wrote letters. They made calls. They showed up at offices only to be told the investigation was ongoing, even as months passed without updates. Eventually, some stopped asking. Others never did. Between 1989 and 1993, the few leads that surfaced had a way of collapsing almost as soon as they appeared. A pair of hikers claimed they had seen unfamiliar men near the canyon weeks before the murders, then later said they must have been mistaken. A rancher reported hearing gunshots late at night during the search period, then retracted the statement after a follow-up visit from federal officials. Every thread unraveled the moment it was pulled. One early theory focused on a local survivalist group that trained in remote areas. Their land bordered parts of the canyon system. They owned firearms. They fit, at least superficially, the profile people wanted to believe. Investigators interviewed members, executed warrants, combed through property. Nothing connected them to the hikers. No matching ammunition. No motive. They were quietly cleared, and the attention evaporated as quickly as it had arrived. Another rumor centered on a fringe religious sect said to operate in the desert, living off-grid and distrustful of outsiders. By the time authorities looked into it, the group had dissolved. Members scattered. Records thin. Nothing tangible remained to pursue. Each dead end added to a growing sense that the case wasn't failing because of lack of effort. It was failing because of resistance. One man felt that more acutely than anyone else. Detective Thomas Cairo had been assigned to the case early on, initially as a supporting investigator. He wasn't a loud presence. He didn't grandstand or leak information. He worked methodically, quietly, and with a level of persistence that made people uncomfortable. While others rotated off the case or accepted its stagnation, Cairo stayed. He began noticing things that didn't sit right. Federal land use files tied to Red Canyon arrived heavily redacted, far more than similar documents he'd seen in other cases. Entire sections were blacked out with no explanation beyond generic security language. Requests for clarification were returned unanswered or bounced between departments. Ranger patrol logs raised more questions. Certain days showed overlapping patrols that shouldn't have occurred. Other days, patrols were logged in areas that, according to official maps, didn't exist. A handful of rangers who had been active in the canyon during 1988 were suddenly gone. Transferred, retired early. One left law enforcement entirely. When Cairo tried to interview them, he met polite refusals. Some claimed they didn't remember details. Others said they weren't comfortable discussing the case anymore. A few simply never returned his calls. Colleagues advised him to let it go. The case was cold. The victims were gone. Pushing too hard wouldn't bring them back. But Cairo couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was intentional. That someone, somewhere, was counting on time to do what intimidation couldn't. The first real crack came from someone entirely outside law enforcement. In early 1992, Cairo received a message from a man named Miles Arden. Arden had been a contract surveyor in the late 1980s, hired intermittently by federal agencies to map terrain in remote areas. He claimed he'd worked in Red Canyon around the same time the hikers disappeared. At first, Cairo assumed it would lead nowhere. People came forward, with stories all the time. Most were wrong. Some were looking for attention. But Arden's message was different. It was restrained, specific. He didn't claim to know what happened to the hikers. He said only that something he'd seen years earlier had started bothering him again. They met quietly. Arden was careful with his words. He described encountering a group of armed men while conducting surveys in the canyon. Not military, not law enforcement, at least not in any recognizable form. No insignia, no name tags, just weapons, radios, and a clear sense of authority. They told him to leave the area, didn't threaten him, didn't explain themselves, just made it clear that he wasn't supposed to be there. Arden complied. He filed a report with his contracting agency. The report went nowhere. He was reassigned shortly after. At the time, he accepted it. Contractors didn't ask questions. They didn't get answers anyway. But after the hikers were found dead, the memory took on a different weight. Chiaro listened, took notes, asked careful questions. Arden didn't exaggerate. He admitted what he didn't know. He didn't name names. He didn't speculate beyond what he'd seen. That restraint made the account harder to dismiss. If Arden was telling the truth, it meant there had been an armed presence in the canyon operating outside visible military channels. It meant someone had been enforcing a boundary that didn't officially exist. The implication was enormous and dangerous. Chiaro began piecing together a theory he knew he couldn't voice openly. A covert security unit, not officially acknowledged, possibly contracted, possibly deniable, tasked with protecting something inside the closed zone, something valuable enough to justify lethal force. Without proof, it was just a suspicion. Worse than that, it was a suspicion that could end his career. Every attempt to push the idea further met resistance. Requests for records were delayed. Meetings were canceled. One supervisor warned him that he was misinterpreting coincidences. Another suggested that Arden's account was unreliable. Chiaro understood the message. There were limits, lines he wasn't supposed to cross. But he also understood something else. 11 people hadn't died because of coincidence. They hadn't been executed because of confusion. Whatever happened in Red Canyon was intentional, controlled, and covered. The cost of pursuing that truth became personal. Invitations to briefings stopped coming. His role in other investigations diminished. He was warned, indirectly, about becoming fixated. Still, he kept working. Late nights, personal notes, quiet interviews. He documented everything, knowing that even if he couldn't act on it now, someone might one day. By 1993, the case was officially dormant. No active leads, no task force, no public updates. For most involved, it was over. For Chiaro, it wasn't. He had enough to know that the truth existed. He just didn't yet have enough to prove it. And the longer the silence held, the more he realized that whoever had ordered the killings wasn't worried. They were waiting for memories to fade, for witnesses to age out, for the world to move on. What they hadn't accounted for was time working the other way. People changed, loyalties weakened, guilt accumulated, and somewhere beyond Red Canyon, the men who believed they had erased a mistake were about to learn that some things don't stay buried forever. In early 1995, the Red Canyon case was still officially dormant when a routine investigation hundreds of miles away cracked it open again. In New Mexico, a local homicide tied to an illegal weapons trafficking ring brought federal agents into a world of unregistered firearms, shell companies, and off-book security contracts. At first, it had nothing to do with Utah, nothing to do with hikers. It was just another case involving men who moved guns quietly and disappeared before anyone thought to ask where they came from. Then the ballistics report came back. One of the shell casings recovered at the New Mexico crime scene matched markings logged years earlier in Red Canyon. Same manufacturing run, same microscopic tool marks, ammunition that had never been traced because no one had known where to look. Until now. The connection was thin, but undeniable. 2 crime scenes, 7 years apart, linked by the same type of untraceable military-grade rounds. The odds of coincidence were negligible. When the information reached investigators familiar with the Utah case, it landed with the weight of confirmation rather than surprise. For Detective Thomas Kiro, it was the first time the theory he'd carried alone for years felt tangible. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was evidence. Federal agencies began coordinating quietly. Not task forces, not public announcements, just a tightening circle of people who suddenly understood that Red Canyon hadn't been an anomaly. It had been part of a larger system that had outlived its original purpose. The trail led to a private security firm that no longer officially existed. On paper, it had dissolved in the early 1990s. In reality, it had simply fragmented. Multiple shell names, temporary contracts, short-term consulting arrangements that left no permanent footprint. During the late Cold War, it had been used unofficially to guard sensitive federal projects that couldn't attract attention, the kind of work that thrived in ambiguity. Former operatives were hard to find. Many had moved on. Some had died. A few were still active in adjacent industries. When approached, most declined to speak, until immunity was offered. That changed everything. Testimony came slowly, and never all at once. Each account filled in a piece of a structure that had been deliberately designed to look incomplete. The firm had operated in remote locations. They used their own communications. They wore no insignia. They answered to field commanders rather than traditional chains of command. Their purpose wasn't enforcement. It was containment. One name surfaced again and again: Gordon Hale. Hale had never been listed as an employee. He wasn't on payrolls or official rosters, but multiple operatives identified him as a field commander, the man who made decisions when circumstances fell outside written instructions. Known for what former colleagues called zero-leak enforcement. Problems were handled quickly, quietly, permanently if necessary. According to testimony, the Red Canyon unit had been assigned to protect a closed zone containing sensitive infrastructure tied to legacy federal projects. By the late 1980s, the original purpose of the site had faded, but the security posture remained. No one had formally shut it down, and no one wanted to explain why it had existed in the first place. When the 11 hikers entered the zone, the unit noticed immediately movement in an area that was supposed to be empty. Radio transmissions logged at a ranger outpost that didn't align with the security team's expectations. To men trained to interpret unknown presence as threat, the hikers didn't look like tourists. They looked like reconnaissance. The decision to intercept them wasn't made in panic. It was procedural. Detain, identify, assess. The unit had done it before with surveyors, contractors, and lost hunters. Most encounters ended with warnings. This one didn't. Testimony revealed that the hikers were detained without resistance. They trusted authority. They assumed they were being questioned by legitimate officials. Their radios were destroyed immediately, their hands restrained. They were moved off established routes into terrain the unit controlled completely. Interrogation followed. Names, affiliations, purpose. The hikers had no answers that satisfied men already convinced. They were lying. The longer the questioning went on, the more the situation hardened. According to multiple accounts, the final decision came from Hale. He believed the hikers had seen too much, that even releasing them risked exposure, not just of the site, but of the unit itself. There would be no report, no paperwork, no official acknowledgement. The order was given. The killings were carried out the same way the unit handled everything else. Controlled. Efficient. No unnecessary violence. No emotion. Just a task completed in sequence. Afterward, the bodies were distributed in a way that avoided immediate discovery, but ensured they wouldn't all be found together. Equipment was removed selectively. Anything traceable was destroyed. The site was cleaned with the expectation that search efforts would be delayed, restricted, and ultimately inconclusive. For years, that expectation held. But by 1995, the system that had protected them was breaking down. Cold War secrecy no longer carried the same weight. Budgets changed, priorities shifted, people retired, and some of the men involved began to worry that silence no longer guaranteed safety. When immunity deals were offered, the wall cracked. In early 1996, sealed indictments were prepared. Names were included that the public would never hear. Charges were specific and narrow: conspiracy, illegal detention, homicide. The language avoided anything that would require broader explanation. Arrests were made quietly. Early mornings, unmarked vehicles, no press, no announcements. Defendants were moved through federal courts under tight restrictions. Plea agreements followed. Sentences were long, but negotiated. Cooperation was rewarded. There was no trial that laid everything bare. No courtroom moment where the full story was told start to finish. That, too, was intentional. Families were notified in fragments, told that arrests had been made, that responsibility had been established, that further details were classified. Some were given confirmation of what they already suspected. Others were left with legal summaries that felt hollow. The case was officially closed in late 1996. On paper, justice had been served. In reality, the truth remained compartmentalized. Files sealed, testimony restricted, records buried beneath legal language designed to satisfy accountability without inviting scrutiny. For Detective Chiaro, the resolution brought no relief. He had been right, but being right came at a cost. The full story would never be public. The men responsible would never be known outside a narrow circle. The institution that allowed it to happen would never face consequences. What remained was certainty. The hikers hadn't been lost. They hadn't been victims of random violence. They had been eliminated because they crossed into a space guarded by men who were never supposed to exist. And as the legal process concluded behind closed doors, one question lingered, unanswered and unacknowledged. If this unit had operated for years without oversight, how many other lines existed on maps that no one could see? The case was solved, but the silence surrounding it made one thing clear. Some truths are only allowed to surface when they can be buried again just as quickly. By late 1996, the Red Canyon case was no longer active. On paper, it was resolved. The language used in the final filings was precise and restrained, stripped of emotion and context. Several individuals had accepted plea agreements. Federal sentences were imposed quietly, without spectacle. No public accounting followed. No press conference. No acknowledgement that a mistake had been made, or that the public had ever been at risk. For the institutions involved, the matter was closed. For the families, it never was. They were informed through letters and short phone calls that arrests had occurred and responsibility had been established. Details were limited, names were withheld. Motives were summarized in neutral terms that felt disconnected from the reality of what had happened to their loved ones. When questions pressed too close to classified ground, answers stopped. Some families asked to visit the canyon, to see where their sons and daughters had spent their final hours, to stand in the place where the search had ended and the truth had begun. Those requests were denied. Portions of the site were now restricted due to environmental hazards. The phrase appeared repeatedly, always without explanation. It was final. There would be no exceptions. No memorial was held in Red Canyon. No marker placed. The land was treated as if the deaths had been an unfortunate footnote rather than a deliberate act. Official maps removed the old fire road entirely. Trail designations changed. What had once been an accessible route became, in effect, a blank space. Time moved on for everyone else. News cycles shifted. The story faded from public awareness. But for the families, time behaved differently. It didn't soften the edges. It sharpened them. Parents replayed the last conversations they'd had with their children. Ordinary exchanges. Talk of weather. Plans for when they'd be back. No fear. No warning. The knowledge that the hikers had trusted the authority they encountered made the loss harder to process. Trust had been the very thing that ended their lives. Siblings carried a different weight. Many suspected that the truth went deeper than what had been disclosed. They compared notes, noticed inconsistencies, the sealed records, the careful wording, the way officials avoided certain questions without ever refusing outright. It created a sense that the story they'd been given was only the surface. Some tried to pursue legal action. Most were quietly discouraged. Statutes, jurisdiction, classification. Each barrier was presented as procedural, not personal. The effect was the same. The door stayed closed. The canyon itself changed slowly. Access points remained monitored. Signage warned against entry into certain zones. Hikers who strayed too close were redirected without explanation. Locals learned not to ask questions. Outsiders rarely noticed anything unusual. It blended into the landscape of restricted areas that dot the American West, places people accept without fully understanding. Detective Thomas Kiro retired the same year the case was officially closed. He did not attend any ceremonies marking its conclusion. There was nothing to attend. He cleared his desk methodically, leaving behind the files he was required to leave, and taking with him only his personal notes. He had been careful with them for years, knowing they were as much a record of his conscience as of the investigation. Before he left, he recorded a final statement. It wasn't for the public. It wasn't even for his department. It was for himself, a way to put words to a truth that had lived with him for nearly a decade. He said the hikers weren't lost. They weren't victims of the wilderness. They didn't make a fatal mistake in navigation or judgment. They were erased, removed, because they crossed into a space that valued secrecy over human life. Caro understood that this statement would never appear in an official report. It wouldn't be quoted. It wouldn't change the outcome. But it mattered to him that the truth existed somewhere unfiltered. Retirement didn't bring relief. The case stayed with him, not as an obsession, but as a reminder. He had learned how power protected itself, how silence could be manufactured, how justice could be administered in a way that satisfied the system while leaving human needs unmet. Years later, when asked privately whether the case haunted him, he didn't hesitate. He said it did. Not because it remained unsolved, but because it had been solved in a way that denied closure to the people who deserved it most. The families grew older. Some parents passed away without ever learning the full story. Others continued to mark anniversaries quietly, away from cameras and reporters. The absence became a permanent part of their lives, not dramatic, just constant. Every so often, someone would ask about Red Canyon, a journalist, a hiker, a researcher piecing together old cases. The answers they received were always partial, enough to explain the outcome, not enough to understand the cause. The truth existed, but it was compartmentalized, locked behind classifications and legal agreements that ensured it would never be fully seen. That was the price of resolution. Accountability without transparency. Justice without acknowledgement. The canyon remains partially restricted decades later. Its silence is unremarkable to most people who pass nearby. Just another stretch of land with rules and warnings. But for those who know the story, it carries a different weight. Not because of what happened there, but because of how carefully it was allowed to disappear. This case did not fade into myth. It did not dissolve into speculation or rumor. It was solved. Names were known. Orders were traced. Consequences were imposed. And yet, the scars never closed. Because closure isn't just about knowing what happened. It's about being allowed to grieve honestly, to speak the truth without redaction, to acknowledge that a wrong occurred and that it mattered. In Red Canyon, that permission was never granted. Not all mysteries end in darkness or uncertainty. Some end in sealed files and quiet sentences. Some end with answers that are real, verified, and forever incomplete. The hikers were not lost to the land. They were taken by it. And the silence that followed was not an accident.